Tonight on Primetime Politics, tariff war.
Starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations.
Donald Trump unveils his plans to tariff America's trading partners, sparking fears of a global recession. Coming up, we'll examine the potential impact these tariffs will have on Canada and potential responses Canada could employ to ensure future prosperity here at home. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Canada's closest neighbor is once again taking aim at its trading partners. Late this afternoon, Donald Trump introducing sweeping tariffs against countries that exchange goods with the United States that begins with a 10% baseline tariff on all foreign goods entering that country.
Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. And I say that friend and foe, and in many cases the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. But such horrendous imbalances have devastated our industrial base and put our national security at risk. I don't blame these other countries at all for this calamity. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen. And they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles.
Now, during that speech, Trump did mention Canadian dairy, but take a look at what the White House fact sheet actually says about Canada. First, USMCA-compliant goods will continue to see a 0% tariff. Non-USMCA-compliant goods will see a 25% tariff, and non-USMCA-compliant energy and potash will see a 10% tariff. Well, to dig into this whole topic, we're now joined this evening by two people who are keeping a very close eye on this subject. We're first and foremost joined by Senator Hassan Yussuff in studio, and right beside him from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the President and CEO, Brian Kingston. Hello to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So, Brian, I'll begin with you here because, you know, Donald Trump in that speech does talk about a 25% tariff on foreign-made cars, meaning cars made out of the United States. But then there's that subclause about USMCA compliant, or as we call it here, CUSMA compliant industries. So when you look at what was said today, how do you interpret that in terms of a tariff impact on the Canadian auto industry?
Well, first of all, somewhat positive news that reciprocal tariffs were not applied to Canada that would be stackable on the existing automotive tariff. So what we know for Canadian facilities is that a 25% tariff will apply to a Canadian manufactured vehicle, but it will only comply to the non-USA built component of that vehicle. So in Canada, if you look at the facilities that Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis operate, over 50% of the parts and components in those vehicles are American. So Canada is in a relatively better off position than other auto industries in other countries around the world. Again, this is still going to drive costs throughout the supply chain, but all in all, the outcome could have been far worse today.
Okay, all in all, it could have been far worse, but we're still talking about a tariff ultimately on the Canadian auto industry. So talk to us about the impact that's going to have.
It will make Canada less competitive when we're competing for automotive investment because this is now just a new cost of building vehicles in this country. More concerning is what happens on parts. There still is a threat of tariffs being applied to automotive parts, which cross the border multiple times, anywhere between 4 and 8 times in a typical North American assembled vehicle. So if you add that up, we could see huge costs through the supply chain, which ultimately means vehicle prices will go up between $4,500 and $10,000. You'll see demand go down, and we could see production slowdowns, not just in Canada, across the North American economy.
Okay, production slowdowns, which of course means, Senator, that people look at the possibility of either losing shifts or losing jobs altogether. So what's your response to what was announced today by the U.S. administration?
Listen, what this done is compound what the president's already done. Fentanyl and border tariff, steel and aluminum tariff, auto tariff, and now reciprocal tariff. All of this, of course, are going to have a devastating impact on the overall Canadian economy. And I think as we try to work through the details more specifically, I think we can expect, obviously, the economy is going to slow. workers are going to get laid off from the workplaces across this country, and more importantly, that's just going to add to the uncertainty as we go forward. At a time where we have an agreement with the United States, that the United States are now not prepared to comply with USMCA, which the President negotiated, and it raised serious question about the reliability of the United States as a trading partner. If they can't comply with an agreement that this President negotiated, what can we say for certain that this President will prepare to do should we negotiate or look at how we can examine the current agreement to make it better than it already is? But the reality is, of course, workers are going to be very worried today going to sleep tonight, and their families and communities should be very worried about what impact that's going to have on the broader economy, wherever they may live, if they work in a facility that are impacted by all these tariffs in totality. So I think for a country, of course, we've got to look at how we retaliate, and more importantly, how we're going to protect workers in the community going forward with the tariff revenue that we raise to ensure that people are going to be assured until we sit down with the United States to figure out how we get through all of this. They need to be taken care of, and the government has got a huge responsibility in that regard.
Okay, huge responsibility, but you sit at the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Canada-U.S. relations. So extrapolating from the meetings that you've had around that council, what is the government willing or prepared to do to help out Canadian workers? Because if it's not obvious now, I think from everything that we're hearing and seeing, it's going to be very obvious sooner rather than later that this is going to cause economic hardship.
It is. The government's already announced some measures that doesn't require Parliament to act, that workers will be entitled to EI, and they will make sure that the severance pay a worker get doesn't disqualify them from starting to collect. The waiting period are gone, which is really important. But in addition to that, of course, as time goes on and the election will be over, Parliament will need to act to, of course, put some other measures in place to look after those workers that are impacted. Prime Minister already pledged that all of the tariff revenue that's raised are going to be spent to look after workers across this country. So I think all of that is good news. But in the same time, what workers really want to do is be assured they're going to have a job to go to and a workplace to go to, and they want to make sure they're going to have the things that we take for granted when we're working: a pension, a secure paycheck, and more importantly, that you don't have to worry waking up in the morning whether or not that job's going to be there.
Mm-hmm. You know, Brian, I had to note the fact that during the news conference today, or the event, or whatever you want to call it, that Donald Trump held in the Rose Garden of the U.S. White House, he had up there an auto worker from Michigan who was very enthusiastic that Donald Trump is talking about tariffing countries that the United States trades with. And part of that is this belief that Donald Trump will be able to bring to the United States production. We'll be able to bring back the car companies, reopen factories, reopen parts factories. Is that a danger, the very fact that Donald Trump may succeed in this for the Canadian auto industry?
It absolutely is a danger, but it's not feasible for a few reasons. First of all, the Americans build about 10 million vehicles a year. They consume 16 million. If you were to try and replace Canadian manufacturing capacity, you'd be talking about 5 to 6 assembly plants, billions of dollars, in at least 10 years to bring that back into the United States. During that process, you would be making U.S. manufacturers deeply uncompetitive. This industry has been founded on an integrated North American market, really going back to the 60s. While other countries are advancing, you look at Chinese manufacturing capacity, huge threat to the automotive industry. If we are fighting amongst ourselves and divvying up the North American market, we will all be worse off. So that may be the objective. It's not feasible.
Not feasible, as you say, but how much runway is there before that's discovered? Because, you know, I wonder whether or not, and you've been very optimistic throughout this whole process, saying that the facts will I guess in your hope, would influence the administration to stay away from such tariffs. But so far, that's not what's happening. So how much runway is there before the administration comes to that conclusion, do you think?
I think it's all going to come down to the American consumer. If people realize that their vehicle prices are going to go up by thousands of dollars at a time where the U.S. economy is already suffering from inflationary pressures, you add to that the potential for a global trade war if other countries retaliate in a coordinated fashion. If the American consumer feels that these policies are making them significantly worse off, there will be blowback. And that does take some time, but that's where this policy is ultimately going to lead.
Okay, listen, Brian, Senator, I'm going to ask both of you to stay there, but, you know, we'll continue the discussion. We have more voices being added on, including a voice from the United States. Well, the tariffs unveiled by Trump today will also have an impact on the global economy, potentially the U.S. economy. And keeping an eye on this right now is Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat. She has represented Ohio's 9th congressional district since 1983. She is the longest-serving woman in the U.S. Congress. Congresswoman Kaptur, thank you for joining us.
It's my privilege. Thank you so much. We love Canada, where I come from.
Well, it's good to hear that, because I think a lot of Canadians have been asking that question of themselves in recent months. But, I first and foremost want to get your reaction to what was unveiled by Donald Trump, because it seems to be, at least right now, that when he talks about a 10% baseline tariff on all countries doing trade with the United States, there may be an exemption here for USMCA, or as we call it here in Canada, the CUSMA compliant industries. There will be an exemption from them. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it was interesting that the list that the president held up did not have the name Canada on it. And there is a resolution that is bubbling up over in the Senate right now. I understand it's bipartisan. There may be a vote tomorrow or later tonight, I'm not sure when. That is pretty much an endorsement of Canada. So just be aware. And the president didn't really talk about Canada. Canada is our largest trading partner, and I always say our largest fair trading partner. So perhaps there needs to be communication between the leadership of Canada and the Trump administration, because initially when the president talked about Canada, he was concerned about fentanyl and the number of crossings over the border that attended to illicit drug trade. I think it's important that the president understand that most of that situation is down at the Mexican border, not the Canadian border, but he wants to have increased enforcement, and it's important that the nation of Canada communicate that to him directly.
Which I know that they have been in terms of bumping up security at the border for over these last few months. But Canadians have been talking about how harmful a tariff war would actually be to the national economy here. I'm wondering about, when you look at the numbers, what type of impact would a tariff war, a trade war, have on the Ohio economy, on the U.S. economy?
Well, it cuts many ways. Trade, the status quo we have in our nation, where we have been in trade deficit for decades, has hollowed out the region that I represent. And when you start dealing with tariffs, it's a very blunt instrument, and you really have to know what you're doing. So it's not a question of whether we should reform trade. We should, but it has to be done very adroitly. It can't just be with a meat axe. And I think that the president has to be careful in what he does, because we can also have a ricochet effect of rising prices. And our economy is so integrated with Canada in manufacturing, in automotive, in energy, in agriculture. It's just recreation and tourism. We, as Great Lakes nations, have to be fair trade partners and continue this very wholesome relationship that we've had for many, many years. I don't know how much the president really knows about that, and he was dealing with the whole world. And for us here, of course, we have to protect jobs in North America, and we've hemorrhaged those in industrial America, agricultural America, and energy America. So it's he's walking a tightrope between trying to balance our trade accounts and deal with very unfair trade practices and some kind of balance. On the other hand, if he's careless in what he does, we'll find ourselves moving to recession and very upset markets globally, and potentially rising prices here at home, which nobody wants.
So what would your advice be to the administration right now as to how to walk this tightrope to be beneficial to your country and also to Canada? And as you say, the two have been trade partners, in particular with auto, since 1965.
That's right. And I think what we have to do is we have to look, I say fair trade, trade agreements that allow people to live a decent life, a fair wage, environmental standards, which we here on the continent, the North American continent at least, have achieved. And then to bring some of the other nations along. And you have to look at a bigger time horizon than 6 months or 1 year. With some countries, it will take much longer to get any kind of equity. But the president has to be careful if they apply reciprocal tariffs on us, then prices on everything are going to go up. And in our country today, it's pretty hard to find anything made in the USA on the shelves. So he's got to negotiate a very narrow band in a needle here. And with countries that we don't really have a problem like Canada, that ought to be dealt with initially very quickly, and let's get on with the business of the continent here. Stock and bond markets have been very unsteady here over the last, I would say, month and a half, not knowing what he's going to propose. So I'm glad that that's out. We know that in manufacturing America, so many of our towns, like the ones I have represented for many years, were hollowed out, and we're struggling to build back our industrial capacity. And we can do that working with Canada. What's been happening in my region, just so you know, there are billboards going up that say tariffs are taxes. And so there's a pushback already before the president even made his final proposal here. We have oil that comes over the border. We don't know how that's going to fare and what the president is proposing, but I believe in the motto, free trade among free people. And where that does not exist, then you have to deal with other externalities that affect global manufacturing and try to not penalize the people who believe in free trade among free people.
Free trade among free people. I appreciate the sentiment, Congresswoman. Thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so very much.
Okay, well, let's now bring into the program Pascal Chan, Vice President, Strategic Policy and Supply Chains with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Pascal, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Listen, what's your assessment of the impact what was announced today will have on the Canadian economy?
Well, what we heard today really just prolongs the uncertainty and the accompanying pain for millions of Americans and Canadians, including countless integrated businesses. The only thing that this constant back and forth has accomplished is disrupt the supply chains that have fueled North American prosperity for decades. Businesses can't plan ahead, and that means they can't make smart investments under these conditions. Everyone's seen the stock market. It was just mentioned. It's been in a state of constant fluctuation, and that's a really clear signal. It doesn't like tariffs. What it likes is stability. So instead of continuing down this self-destructive path, the president really needs to stop playing games with the livelihoods of North Americans and really get to work on policies that are going to benefit businesses, and that means strengthening rather than weakening our integrated trade relationship.
Now, I think the U.S. president, not to speak for Donald Trump, but is making a gamble here that American companies will, with these tariffs, still be investing, rather will be able to get investment into their industries and into their projects. The reverse of that, of course, would be that Canadian businesses would have a hard time attracting investment. How much of a danger is that for this country?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, your viewers have probably heard this 1,000 times already, but when you talk about the Canadian and American economies, that's $3.6 billion in daily cross-border trade. Our trading relationship is built on a long-standing and frankly still growing foundation of integrated supply chains that enable the fluid movement of goods. And that integration was established with great care and consideration over many, many years to secure a joint economic future. And it's only going to be untangled at huge expense over a long period of time, as Brian mentioned a little bit earlier, during which we're certain to relinquish our global economic standing to our competitors. So very simply, tariffs detrimentally impact the movement of goods and services across the Canada-U.S. border. It leaves both economies increasingly worse off as this trade war persists. And frankly, as was mentioned, as per those billboards you're seeing in the U.S., tariffs are taxes. And that goes for both Canadians and Americans. We watch the markets, I mentioned it, adjust to tariff announcements in recent weeks. Stock prices have gone down, and when trade becomes more expensive, costs rise for businesses, the economy suffers, and consumers are the ones who pay the price.
You know what's interesting about this was, just a few years ago, we were talking about friendshoring with the United States, and now you're talking about this policy actually helping out trade rivals. Who specifically do you think will benefit from this type of policy, if not Canada and the United States?
Certainly, obviously, when you talk about, our place in the world and are we going to be competitive globally, you have to look at markets like, obviously, China. We talked about the steel and aluminum tariffs previously. Again, we have leadership here in North America on that, and putting tariffs on this and damaging industries on both sides, as well as chasing away jobs, are going to hand that leadership over to countries like China. We've talked about auto tariffs earlier. I mean, that North American automotive supply chain has been secure, integrated, and it's resulted in better car cars for consumers since 1965. And as was mentioned earlier, those parts can cross the border up to 8 times before final assembly. So again, with the imposition of tariffs, the U.S. administration is effectively committing to taxing America's automotive manufacturers and increasing the cost of production for a car. But again, it's going to give away that leadership that we have in North America to other competitors elsewhere in the world, notably in Asia and Europe as well.
Okay, listen, Pascal, I'm going to ask you to stay there. I want to bring back into the conversation right now Brian Kingston as well, Senator Hassan, Yussuff on the subject matter. You know, I would argue famously have been very optimistic, Brian, about this whole process, thinking, you know, that we can negotiate, we still can negotiate. What's your feeling right now? Because again, it seems as if all the arguments that have been made leading up into this point has not been heard by the Trump administration.
I'm going to remain the eternal optimist, and the reason for that is in the executive order, as well as the details that came out today with respect to the automotive tariffs. We continue to see references to USMCA, of course, to U.S. parts and components, but there is a growing understanding within the administration that this industry is highly integrated and that it cannot be globally competitive if you do not have Canada forming part of the supply chain. That argument is only strengthened as we start to look towards electrification. You cannot stand up a North American battery supply chain without Canada. It's not possible. We have all of the resources. Of course, we need to be better at getting them out of the ground. But there are so many strong arguments for this relationship to continue. And lastly, America depends on Canada as an export destination for vehicles. The Americans send more cars to Canada than they do to China, Mexico, and Germany combined. So all of this points to a rational reason to have a continued integrated supply chain. That's the source of my optimism.
Yeah, Senator, what do you think? What should Canada be doing in this moment?
Well, I think first we're going to have to reciprocate in regard to the tariff we need to impose on American products coming into this country. But in the long term, we have to sit down and figure out, can we get the relation back to where it was? And if so, what does that mean in regard to the USMCA? Because this was an agreement both 3 countries accept, was a good agreement. It improved the condition for workers in places like Mexico going forward. And more importantly, it also increased the North American content for what was going into vehicles in the 3 countries. If that is not something for us to celebrate, then what possibility exists for us to talk about improvement going forward, given the President's this chaos that we're dealing with? So ultimately sitting down to figure out how we can get that relationship back to the stage it used to be until all of this starting to happen will be really important. But in the meantime, we're dealing with investors having to make decisions whether or not they continue to invest in Canada, whether or not they're going to continue to build in Canada. And more importantly, that creates uncertainty in the community, it creates uncertainty for the workers working in those facilities, but also is damaging, of course, to the larger interests. How do we build a North American integration economy if we're not working with each other to find common solution where we believe there might be problems? Doesn't matter what I agree with them. We should at least say, okay, what is the problem? How we go about doing that? But in the meantime, I think we can get to that table. We don't know what we should expect from the president changing his mind in midstream. Despite everything that's been said today, the president could wake up tomorrow morning and says, oh, guess what? I'm going to add another tariff because I don't like the following. I don't think this is a way for respectful partners to be treating each other. And fundamentally, I think Canadians should say we expect better. Now, I'm going to end on this. We have to start looking at how we build this country up in a resilient way in terms of our own capacity to do things without not necessarily so much relying on the Americans, because what we have done so far, we relied upon them to some degree at our devastation right now. The question is, Canadians are prepared to make some sacrifice to strengthen the economic vitality of this country. If we have them there, how do we ensure we can secure that support going forward to build this country up in a way? Recognize it's the largest trading partner in the United States, but we're also going to have to diversify our trade. If we want to not always be blackmailed by a country and their president or the administration when they decide, hey, we're going to hold you hostage, and you don't have anything to do with what we are going to do until you surrender to our whims. And I don't think that's right for us as a country. But equally, I think Canadians are saying we expect better of the Americans, and we expect better for our economy going forward.
Okay. Pascal, you know, I will, and I apologize for hesitating here. We're also keeping an eye on a feed that's coming to us from Parliament Hill. In fact, let's go right now to the West Block of Parliament. You see there the Prime Minister. Let's take a listen as he prepares to enter a cabinet meeting.
Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors: pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians. We're going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force, and that's what we will do. Alors, en français, si je peux. Monsieur le Président Trump, il vient d'annoncer une série de mesures qui seront changées le système du commerce international dans une manière fondamentale. On fait cela. Il a préservé quelques grands aspects des relations canado-américaines, très importants. Mais en même temps, les tarifs injustifiés contre l'acier et l'aluminium restent en place. Et ce soir, les tarifs dans le secteur automobile vont être mis en vigueur. Et l'administration américaine a souligné qu'il y aura des tarifs dans les secteurs stratégiques, c'est un terme américain, pour les secteurs de bois, le secteur des semi-conducteurs et puis des produits pharmaceutiques. Ensemble, il y aura des impacts sur des millions de Canadiens et Canadiennes à travers le pays. Nous allons lutter contre ce tarif. Nous nous battons contre les tarifs américains. Nous protégeons nos travailleurs et nous bâtissons une économie la plus forte du G7. Dans une crise, ce qui est important, c'est de réunir et d'agir avec de la force. Et ça, c'est le plan du gouvernement. Alors, aujourd'hui, je viens d'avoir une réunion de mon conseil canado-américain. Il y aura une réunion du comité canado-américain du cabinet. Et demain matin, j'aurai une réunion des premiers ministres des provinces et territoires. Et après tout cela, il y aura une réponse canadienne. So I've just had a meeting of my Canada-U.S. Council. I will shortly have a meeting. We will have a meeting of the Cabinet Committee, Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee. Tomorrow morning, we will convene First Ministers of the provinces and territories, and we will have more to say after we have taken those soundings. And we'll be back to you shortly.
And there you have it, the Prime Minister addressing members of the media as he walks into a cabinet meeting to discuss the tariffs announced today by Donald Trump in Washington. And of course, more information to come tomorrow. But in the interim, this is what we heard from Mark Carney, that what was announced today will hurt Canadians, that his government will be formulating a way to fight back along with the provinces. As we heard, there will be a First Minister's conference tomorrow by phone. He's promised to protect workers and to build back the economy. So this really is just the start of the story. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank the Senator for being with us, Hassan Yussuff, as well as Brian Kingston, as well as Pascal Chan from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for the discussion. Again, we're just starting to wrap our heads around what these tariffs announced by Donald Trump means for Canada. We'll have more discussion in the days to come. Thank you for that. And for those at home, thank you for joining us here on CPAC and Primetime Politics. I'm Michael Serapio. Stay tuned. Catherine Lafrance avec l'essentiel is up next.